When my husband brought his 26-year-old secretary to our 15th wedding anniversary dinner and announced he was leaving me for her, he had no idea I was about to reveal the truth that would destroy his career and expose him as the fraud he truly was. What happened next would not only vindicate 15 years of stolen credit and hidden contributions, but would also launch me into a position of power he could never have imagined possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Sterling, and at 43 years old, I had spent the better part of 2 decades building what everyone believed was my husband's empire, while remaining virtually invisible in the shadows of his success. For 15 years, I had been the strategic mind behind Sterling Consulting Group, the premier business advisory firm in Chicago that bore not my name but that of my husband, Jonathan Sterling. What the business world saw was a charismatic CEO who had built a multi-million-dollar consulting empire from the ground up. What they did not see was the woman who had actually architected every major client acquisition, developed every innovative service offering, and solved every critical business challenge that had established the firm's reputation for excellence. The irony of my situation was not lost on me. I possessed an MBA from Northwestern Kellogg School of Management, where I had graduated summa cum laude with a specialization in strategic business transformation. My master's thesis on organizational restructuring had been published in the Harvard Business Review and had become required reading in several graduate programs. Yet for the past 15 years, I had allowed myself to be introduced at business functions as Jonathan Sterling's wife, the woman who managed the administrative details while he handled the important strategic work. This carefully constructed narrative had not emerged overnight. It had developed gradually through a series of small compromises and accommodations that had seemed reasonable at the time but had ultimately created a professional identity that bore no resemblance to my actual contributions or capabilities. When Jonathan and I had first established Sterling Consulting Group in 2009, we had agreed that he would serve as the public face of the company while I would focus on developing our service methodologies and client solutions. This division of labor had made sense given Jonathan's natural comfort with public speaking and networking, combined with my preference for analytical work and strategic development. However, what had begun as a practical allocation of responsibilities had gradually evolved into something far more problematic. As the company grew and gained recognition, Jonathan had become increasingly comfortable taking sole credit for innovations and insights that had originated from my research and analysis. Client presentations that he delivered with confidence and charisma were built entirely on frameworks I had developed during countless late-night sessions in our home office. Strategic recommendations that earned him industry accolades were based on methodologies I had refined through extensive study of organizational psychology and change management principles. The transformation from collaborative partnership to exploitative arrangement had been so gradual that I had not recognized it until it was deeply entrenched in every aspect of our business operations. Jonathan had developed a pattern of referring to my contributions as research support while describing his own role as strategic leadership. When potential clients asked about our team's credentials, he would mention that he had an excellent support staff while focusing the conversation on his own educational background and business experience. Industry publications that featured Sterling Consulting Group invariably focused on Jonathan's vision and leadership, with my role mentioned only in passing or omitted entirely. What made this situation particularly frustrating was my awareness that I possessed capabilities that exceeded those of many of the business leaders who received recognition and compensation far beyond what I had ever achieved. My analytical abilities had enabled me to identify market opportunities and develop innovative solutions that had generated millions of dollars in revenue for our clients. My understanding of organizational dynamics had allowed me to successfully guide complex transformation initiatives that other consulting firms had been unable to complete. My research and writing skills had produced white papers and case studies that had established Sterling Consulting Group as a thought leader in strategic business development. Yet despite these contributions, I remained largely unknown within the business community that had benefited so significantly from my work. When Jonathan was invited to speak at industry conferences, he presented my research as his own insights without acknowledgement or attribution. When business journalists wrote profiles of successful Chicago entrepreneurs, they focused on Jonathan's leadership and vision while treating Sterling Consulting Group as a one-person operation. When potential clients met with our firm to discuss major projects, they expected to work primarily with Jonathan, unaware that the strategic frameworks and analytical methodologies they were purchasing had been developed entirely by someone they had never met. The psychological impact of this systematic invisibility had been more profound than I had initially recognized. I had begun to internalize doubts about my own capabilities and the value of my contributions. When Jonathan dismissed my ideas or interrupted my explanations during client meetings, I had started to wonder whether my perspectives were actually as valuable as I had believed. When industry peers failed to recognize my name or associate me with Sterling Consulting Group's success, I had questioned whether I had overestimated my role in the company's achievements. This erosion of professional confidence had been accompanied by a corresponding deterioration in my personal relationship with Jonathan. As his public profile had grown and his ego had expanded, he had become increasingly dismissive of my opinions and contributions in all areas of our life together. Conversations that had once involved mutual respect and collaborative problem-solving had devolved into monologues where Jonathan explained his perspectives while showing little interest in my thoughts or insights. Social situations had become exercises in watching Jonathan network and self-promote, while I stood silently beside him, introduced only as his supportive wife. The most painful aspect of this dynamic was my recognition that Jonathan genuinely believed his own revised version of our history. He had convinced himself that his role as presenter and networker was equivalent in value to my role as strategist and analyst. He viewed my extensive research and analytical work as support functions that enabled his leadership, rather than recognizing that his presentations were simply the delivery mechanism for my intellectual property. This self-deception had made him immune to logical discussions about credit or recognition, because acknowledging the reality of our respective contributions would have required him to admit that his reputation was built on someone else's work. The business community that celebrated Jonathan's success was equally invested in maintaining this narrative. Industry leaders who had built relationships with Jonathan over the years were comfortable dealing with him as the singular force behind Sterling Consulting Group. They appreciated his ability to articulate complex strategies in accessible language and his skill at building consensus among diverse stakeholders. What they did not want to acknowledge was that the strategies he articulated so effectively had been developed by someone else, and that his consensus-building skills were primarily valuable because they were applied to solutions that had been rigorously researched and tested. This collective investment in Jonathan's singular success story had created a professional environment where questioning the narrative would have been awkward and potentially damaging for everyone involved. Clients who had paid substantial fees for Sterling Consulting Group's services wanted to believe they had been working with a visionary leader rather than a skilled presenter of someone else's ideas. Industry peers who had accepted Jonathan as an equal in their professional community were not eager to discover that their colleagues' expertise was largely borrowed. Media outlets that had featured Jonathan as an entrepreneurial success story had no interest in revisiting those stories to acknowledge a previously overlooked contributor. Within this context, my attempts to gain recognition for my contributions had been consistently unsuccessful and had often backfired by making Jonathan defensive and resistant to any changes in our working relationship. When I had suggested that client presentations should acknowledge my role in developing the strategic frameworks being presented, Jonathan had explained that such acknowledgments would confuse clients and undermine their confidence in his leadership. When I had proposed that industry publications should include information about my background and contributions, he had argued that presenting Sterling Consulting Group as a collaborative effort would dilute the personal branding that had been so effective in attracting new business. These responses had initially seemed reasonable, and I had accepted them as necessary compromises for the good of our shared business interests. However, I had gradually come to understand that Jonathan's concerns were not about business effectiveness, but about maintaining his exclusive claim to the recognition and status that came with being perceived as the singular architect of Sterling Consulting Group's success. He was not protecting our company's interests. He was protecting his own ego and public image at the expense of accuracy and fairness. The realization that I had been systematically erased from the narrative of my own professional achievements had been both devastating and liberating. It had been devastating because it had forced me to confront the extent to which I had enabled my own marginalization through years of accommodation and compromise. It had been liberating because it had clarified that my dissatisfaction was not the result of unrealistic expectations or professional inadequacy, but rather the predictable outcome of a fundamentally unfair and unsustainable arrangement. As I had begun to understand the true nature of my situation, I had also begun to recognize that I possessed capabilities and resources that Jonathan was not aware of and could not control. My extensive network of client contacts had been built through direct interaction during project implementation, and these relationships were based on appreciation for my analytical capabilities and strategic insights, rather than loyalty to Jonathan's leadership. My reputation within academic and research communities had been established through my published work and speaking engagements, independent of any association with Sterling Consulting Group. My understanding of our business operations and client relationships was comprehensive and detailed, while Jonathan's knowledge was largely superficial and dependent on information I provided. Most importantly, I had begun to recognize that the business success attributed to Jonathan was actually the result of methodologies, frameworks, and analytical approaches that I had developed and that existed independently of his involvement. The intellectual property that formed the foundation of Sterling Consulting Group's competitive advantage belonged to me in every meaningful sense, even though legal ownership might be more complicated due to our marriage and business partnership. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This recognition had marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in my understanding of my own power and potential. For the first time in years, I had begun to envision possibilities that did not depend on Jonathan's cooperation or recognition. I had started to imagine what my career might look like if I was able to claim credit for my own work and build professional relationships based on my actual capabilities, rather than my assigned role as a supportive spouse. The foundation for transformation had been established through years of unacknowledged contribution and systematic undervaluation. Every client success that had been attributed to Jonathan's leadership had actually demonstrated my strategic capabilities. Every industry accolade he had received had validated methodologies I had developed. Every business opportunity that had enhanced his reputation had proven the effectiveness of approaches I had researched and refined. Now, as I stood on the threshold of our 15th wedding anniversary, I was about to discover just how little Jonathan valued not only my professional contributions, but our entire relationship. The betrayal that was coming would be shocking in its audacity and cruelty, but it would also provide the catalyst I needed to finally claim the recognition and success that had always rightfully been mine. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose 15 years of deception while launching me toward the professional recognition and personal fulfillment that had been denied for far too long. Jonathan Sterling was about to learn that the woman he had systematically undervalued and marginalized possessed the power to destroy everything he believed he had built while creating something far more successful and authentic in its place. The catalyst that would shatter my carefully maintained world of professional invisibility arrived in the form of what should have been a moment of celebration and recognition. 3 weeks before our 15th wedding anniversary, Jonathan received notification that Sterling Consulting Group had been selected as the recipient of the Chicago Business Excellence Award, the most prestigious recognition available to consulting firms in the metropolitan area. The award was given annually to the organization that had demonstrated the most significant impact on regional economic development through innovative business solutions and strategic leadership. The selection committee had specifically cited our work with Midwest Manufacturing Alliance, a project that had saved over 1,200 jobs while increasing operational efficiency by 47% across 15 different facilities. The transformation had required 18 months of intensive analysis, during which I had developed a comprehensive framework for optimizing supply chain logistics while simultaneously retraining workforce capabilities to meet evolving market demands. The methodology had been so successful that 3 other consulting firms had attempted to replicate our approach, though none had achieved comparable results due to their lack of understanding of the underlying analytical principles. When Jonathan called me from his office to share the news about the award, his excitement was palpable and genuine. He described the recognition as validation of everything we had worked to build over the past 15 years, and he expressed gratitude for my support throughout the journey. However, as he continued talking about the upcoming awards ceremony and the opportunities it would create for further business development, it became clear that his understanding of the recognition was fundamentally different from mine. Jonathan spoke about the award as acknowledgement of his leadership and vision, describing the Midwest Manufacturing Alliance project as his strategic masterpiece, and discussing his plans for leveraging the recognition to attract larger corporate clients. He mentioned that the ceremony would provide him with an excellent networking opportunity and that he was already considering how to incorporate the award into his personal branding and marketing materials. Throughout this 15-minute conversation, he made no reference to my contributions to the award-winning project, despite the fact that every element of the transformation methodology had originated from my research and analysis. This omission was not unusual, as Jonathan had developed a consistent pattern of describing our collaborative work in terms that emphasized his role, while minimizing or eliminating reference to my contributions. However, something about this particular conversation felt different and more problematic than our previous interactions. Perhaps it was the significance of the recognition, or perhaps it was my growing awareness of the systematic nature of his credit appropriation, but I found myself feeling a level of frustration and resentment that I had not experienced before. The conversation concluded with Jonathan explaining that the award ceremony would be held at the Palmer House Hilton, and that he was looking forward to celebrating this milestone achievement with me. He suggested that I should plan to purchase a new dress for the occasion, as there would likely be media coverage and photography that could be valuable for future marketing purposes. The implication was clear. My role at the ceremony would be to serve as an attractive accessory to his success, rather than as a contributor worthy of recognition in my own right. After ending the call, I sat in my home office, surrounded by the research materials, analytical frameworks, and strategic documentation that had formed the foundation of every major success attributed to Jonathan's leadership. The disconnect between the reality of my contributions and the narrative of his singular achievement had never felt more stark or more infuriating. I realized that I was facing a decision point that would define not only my professional future, but also my fundamental sense of self-worth and personal integrity. The Chicago Business Excellence Award represented the culmination of my professional development and analytical capabilities. The methodologies being recognized had emerged from years of intensive study, research, and practical application that had required expertise in organizational psychology, operational efficiency, workforce development, and strategic transformation. The successful implementation had demanded problem-solving skills, analytical rigor, and innovative thinking that had been developed through decades of education and experience. Yet the recognition was being presented as validation of someone else's leadership and vision. I began to understand that this award ceremony would serve as a defining moment in my relationship with Jonathan and my own professional identity. I could continue to accompany him as a supportive spouse while he received recognition for my work, thereby reinforcing the narrative that had marginalized me for 15 years. Alternatively, I could use this opportunity to begin asserting my actual role in our business success, regardless of how Jonathan or others might respond to such assertions. The prospect of challenging the established narrative was both terrifying and exhilarating. I had spent so many years accommodating Jonathan's need for singular recognition that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to consider claiming credit for my own achievements. The thought of standing in that ballroom and hearing Jonathan accept an award for work that I had conceived, developed, and implemented without acknowledging my contributions felt intolerable in a way that previous slights had not. Over the following days, I found myself analyzing the situation with the same systematic approach I applied to client challenges. I began documenting the specific elements of the Midwest Manufacturing Alliance project that had originated from my research and analysis, creating a comprehensive record of my contributions that could not be disputed or minimized. I reviewed email communications, project timelines, and client feedback that clearly demonstrated my central role in developing and implementing the award-winning transformation methodology. This documentation process revealed the extent to which Jonathan's public descriptions of our work had diverged from the factual record of our respective contributions. Client communications consistently referenced my analytical insights and strategic recommendations, while describing Jonathan's role primarily in terms of project coordination and relationship management. Internal project files contained extensive evidence of my research, methodology development, and problem-solving, while Jonathan's contributions were limited to presentation materials and scheduling coordination. The documentation also revealed patterns in our client relationships that I had not previously recognized. Many of our most successful engagements had resulted from clients specifically requesting to work with me based on recommendations from previous projects. These clients valued my analytical capabilities and strategic insights, often expressing preference for dealing directly with me rather than working through Jonathan's management oversight. Several major clients had developed what were essentially personal relationships with me, built on respect for my expertise and appreciation for my ability to solve complex organizational challenges. This analysis led to a crucial realization about the nature of our business success and my own professional market value. Sterling Consulting Group's competitive advantage was not based on Jonathan's leadership or relationship management skills, which were competent but not exceptional. Our success was built on the methodologies, frameworks, and analytical approaches that I had developed, combined with my ability to implement these approaches effectively in diverse organizational contexts. The intellectual property that formed the foundation of our business belonged to me in every meaningful sense, even though legal and financial ownership might be more complicated due to our marriage and business partnership. As I came to understand the true source of our professional success, I also began to recognize the extent of my own power and independence within our business relationship. Jonathan's role, while valuable for certain client interactions and administrative functions, was not essential to the delivery of the services that had earned Sterling Consulting Group its reputation for excellence. I possessed the knowledge, skills, and client relationships necessary to continue providing high-value consulting services with or without his involvement. This recognition was both liberating and overwhelming. For 15 years, I had operated under the assumption that my professional success was dependent on Jonathan's support, and that challenging his leadership would jeopardize our shared business interests. The documentation process had revealed that the opposite was actually true. Jonathan's professional success was entirely dependent on my contributions, while my capabilities and client relationships provided a foundation for independent success that exceeded anything we had achieved together. The implications of this realization extended beyond professional considerations to encompass my entire relationship with Jonathan and my understanding of my own worth and potential. I began to recognize that the dynamic of systematic undervaluation that characterized our business relationship was also present in our personal interactions. Jonathan had developed patterns of dismissing my opinions, interrupting my contributions to conversations, and treating my interests and priorities as secondary to his own. These patterns had been so gradual and subtle that I had not recognized them as problematic until I began analyzing them with the same rigor I applied to business challenges. The award ceremony was still 2 weeks away, but I had already begun to understand that it would serve as more than a recognition event. It would be a test of my willingness to continue enabling Jonathan's appropriation of my work, and a measure of my commitment to claiming the recognition and respect that I had earned through 15 years of exceptional contribution. The choice I made about how to handle this situation would determine not only my professional future, but also my fundamental relationship with my own capabilities and worth. During this period of analysis and reflection, I also began to notice changes in Jonathan's behavior that suggested he was preparing for something beyond the award ceremony. He had been working longer hours and taking more private phone calls, often stepping out of our shared office space when certain calls came in. His computer usage patterns had changed, with more attention to password protection and private browsing sessions. Most significantly, he had begun making comments about expanding our business operations and potentially bringing in additional partners or staff members to support our growth. These behavioral changes, combined with his increasing tendency to describe Sterling Consulting Group as his personal achievement rather than our collaborative effort, created a growing sense of unease about his intentions and commitment to our partnership. I began to suspect that Jonathan was considering changes to our business arrangement that might further marginalize my role or potentially exclude me entirely from the success we had built together. The catalyst moment had arrived not as a single dramatic event, but as an accumulation of realizations and recognitions that made continued acceptance of my marginalized status impossible. The Chicago Business Excellence Award had crystallized 15 years of systematic undervaluation into a single, undeniable example of credit appropriation that I could no longer ignore or rationalize. The documentation process had revealed the extent of my contributions and the depth of my professional capabilities. The analysis of our business relationship had exposed the true source of our success and my own potential for independent achievement. As I prepared for the award ceremony, I understood that I was approaching a defining moment that would determine the trajectory of both my professional and personal life. The woman who had accommodated and enabled Jonathan's success for 15 years was about to be tested in her commitment to claiming her own power and recognition. The catalyst had been activated, and there would be no returning to the comfortable but unsustainable patterns that had defined our relationship for so long. The foundation had been shaken, and the transformation was about to begin. Jonathan Sterling was about to discover that the woman he had systematically undervalued possessed not only the capability to expose his dependence on her contributions, but also the strength to claim the recognition and success that had always rightfully belonged to her. The days following my revelation about the Chicago Business Excellence Award brought an unexpected and overwhelming wave of internal resistance that challenged every assumption I had made about my readiness for transformation. Despite the clear evidence I had assembled regarding my contributions to Sterling Consulting Group's success, I found myself struggling with doubts and fears that seemed to emerge from the deepest recesses of my psyche. The comfortable patterns of accommodation and self-denial that had defined my professional relationship with Jonathan for 15 years were not easily abandoned, even when I understood intellectually that they were harmful and unsustainable. The first form of resistance manifested as a persistent voice of self-doubt that questioned both my perceptions and my right to challenge the established narrative surrounding our business success. This internal critic suggested that my analysis of our respective contributions might be biased by resentment, and that I was overestimating my role while unfairly minimizing Jonathan's leadership capabilities. The voice reminded me of instances when Jonathan had made valuable contributions to client relationships or project outcomes, arguing that these contributions might be more significant than I was acknowledging in my current state of frustration and anger. This self-doubt was particularly insidious because it contained elements of truth that made it difficult to dismiss entirely. Jonathan had indeed contributed to our business success in ways that were meaningful and valuable, even if they were different from my own contributions. His networking abilities had opened doors to opportunities that might not have been available otherwise. His presentation skills had helped communicate complex analytical insights in ways that clients found accessible and compelling. His willingness to serve as the public face of our organization had allowed me to focus on the analytical and strategic work that I found most fulfilling. However, as I examined these doubts more carefully, I began to recognize that acknowledging Jonathan's contributions did not negate the validity of my own concerns about recognition and credit. The issue was not whether Jonathan had contributed value to our partnership, but whether the current arrangement fairly represented our respective contributions and provided appropriate recognition for the work each of us had performed. The systematic erasure of my role from the narrative of our success was problematic regardless of Jonathan's genuine contributions to our achievements. The second form of resistance emerged as fear about the potential consequences of asserting my rightful place in our business success. This fear was multifaceted and encompassed both professional and personal concerns that felt overwhelming when considered collectively. Professionally, I worried that challenging Jonathan's established position as the singular leader of Sterling Consulting Group might damage our reputation with existing clients and harm our ability to attract new business. The consulting industry placed significant emphasis on stable leadership and clear organizational hierarchy, and any public disagreement about roles and contributions might be perceived as internal instability that could undermine client confidence. These professional concerns were compounded by uncertainty about my own ability to function effectively as the recognized leader of our organization. Despite my extensive experience and proven analytical capabilities, I had never served as the primary client contact for major engagements or represented our firm at industry events and conferences. The prospect of assuming these responsibilities felt daunting, particularly given my awareness that many clients and industry peers knew me only as Jonathan's supportive spouse, rather than as a business professional with independent credentials and expertise. The personal consequences of challenging our established dynamics seemed even more threatening and unpredictable. Jonathan's identity and self-worth had become deeply intertwined with his role as the successful leader of Sterling Consulting Group. Any challenge to this identity might provoke defensive reactions that could damage or destroy our marriage and family relationships. Our social circle consisted primarily of other business couples who knew us through Jonathan's professional activities. And disrupting the established narrative might result in social isolation and loss of friendships that had developed over many years. Financial considerations added another layer of complexity to my resistance and fear. Sterling Consulting Group represented not only our primary source of income, but also our most significant asset for retirement planning and long-term financial security. Any conflict that resulted in the dissolution of our business partnership might have devastating consequences for both our immediate financial stability and our future economic prospects. The legal complications of separating personal and professional relationships that had been intertwined for 15 years seemed potentially overwhelming and certainly expensive. These practical concerns were accompanied by more fundamental fears about my own capabilities and worthiness that had been shaped by years of systematic undervaluation and marginalization. Despite the evidence I had assembled regarding my contributions to our success, I continued to struggle with imposter syndrome that questioned whether I truly possessed the expertise and leadership abilities necessary for independent professional success. The voice of self-doubt suggested that my analytical capabilities might be less exceptional than I believed, and that my success had been dependent on Jonathan's support and guidance in ways that I was not fully acknowledging. This imposter syndrome was reinforced by the reactions of friends and family members when I began tentatively discussing my concerns about recognition and credit. Many people expressed surprise at my suggestions that I had played a central role in developing Sterling Consulting Group's success, as they had consistently heard Jonathan described as the singular founder and leader of the organization. Some well-meaning friends suggested that my frustrations might be the result of unrealistic expectations about recognition for support roles, arguing that many successful partnerships involved one person serving as the public face, while others provided behind-the-scenes contributions. These external responses felt particularly painful because they reflected the extent to which I had been erased from the narrative of my own professional achievements. People who had known us for years had accepted Jonathan's version of our partnership without question, and they seemed genuinely unable to imagine that the reality of our working relationship might differ significantly from the public presentation. Their surprise and skepticism about my assertions reinforced my own doubts about whether I was overestimating my contributions or being unrealistic about the recognition I deserved. The internal conflict was further complicated by my genuine affection and respect for Jonathan as a person, despite my growing frustration with his professional behavior. We had built a life together that included many positive elements beyond our business partnership, and I valued the family relationships and shared experiences that had developed over 15 years of marriage. Jonathan was not a malicious person who had deliberately set out to exploit my contributions, but rather someone who had gradually developed patterns of behavior that served his own interests without consideration of their impact on my professional development and recognition. This recognition made it more difficult to maintain the anger and resentment that had initially motivated my desire for change. When I observed Jonathan interacting with our children or supporting me through personal challenges, I was reminded of his positive qualities and the genuine care he felt for our family. These observations created cognitive dissonance that made it harder to sustain the emotional energy necessary for challenging our established professional dynamic. The resistance also manifested as a desire to find compromise solutions that might address my concerns about recognition without requiring fundamental changes to our working relationship. I spent considerable time developing proposals for gradually increasing my visibility within Sterling Consulting Group while maintaining Jonathan's position as the primary leader and public representative. These proposals included ideas for joint presentations at industry conferences, collaborative authorship of articles and white papers, and shared recognition in marketing materials and client communications. However, as I developed these compromise proposals, I began to recognize that they failed to address the fundamental issues that had created my dissatisfaction with our current arrangement. The problem was not simply a lack of recognition for my contributions, but rather a systematic pattern of credit appropriation that had erased my professional identity and marginalized my role in our shared success. Incremental changes that provided token recognition while maintaining the basic structure of our unequal partnership would not resolve the deeper issues of respect, acknowledgement, and fair representation that had become increasingly important to my sense of professional fulfillment. This realization led to a period of intense internal struggle as I wrestled with the implications of pursuing more fundamental change. The comfortable patterns of accommodation and support that had defined my role for 15 years were deeply ingrained and felt natural despite their limitations. Challenging these patterns required me to embrace uncertainty and risk in ways that felt foreign and uncomfortable, particularly given my preference for analytical planning and systematic preparation. The internal conflict reached its peak during a client meeting where I observed Jonathan presenting my latest research on organizational transformation methodologies to a potential new client. As I watched him confidently explain concepts and frameworks that I had developed through months of intensive study and analysis, I experienced a moment of perfect clarity about the unsustainability of our current arrangement. The disconnect between his confident presentation and his actual understanding of the underlying principles was obvious to me, even if it was not apparent to the client, who was impressed by his communication skills and professional demeanor. In that moment, I understood that my choice was not between comfort and risk, but between continued self-betrayal and authentic self-expression. The compromise solutions I had been considering would simply perpetuate the fundamental dishonesty that had characterized our professional relationship for years. Continuing to enable Jonathan's appropriation of my work would not only prevent my own professional development, but would also undermine the integrity and effectiveness of the services we provided to our clients. The realization that I was facing a choice between authenticity and accommodation marked the beginning of my transition from internal conflict to external action. The resistance and fears that had seemed overwhelming began to feel more manageable when I understood that they were natural responses to the prospect of significant change, rather than indications that change was inappropriate or impossible. My doubts about my capabilities and worthiness were not accurate assessments of my potential, but rather internalized messages that had resulted from years of systematic undervaluation. The Chicago Business Excellence Awards ceremony was now less than a week away, and I understood that it would serve as a defining moment in my relationship with Jonathan and my own professional identity. The internal conflict had been necessary for helping me understand the full implications of the choice I was facing, but it had also clarified that maintaining the status quo was no longer psychologically or professionally sustainable. As I prepared for what might be the most important week of my professional life, I felt a growing sense of determination that transcended my fears and doubts. The woman who had accommodated Jonathan's success for 15 years was ready to claim her own power and recognition, regardless of the consequences. The resistance had been overcome, and the transformation was about to accelerate toward its inevitable conclusion. The breakthrough that would fundamentally alter my understanding of my situation and capabilities came through an unexpected encounter with Dr. Margaret Chen, a renowned organizational psychologist and executive coach who had built her reputation by helping high-performing professionals navigate complex career transitions and reclaim their authentic professional identities. Our meeting occurred during what should have been a routine visit to Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, where I had returned to conduct research for a white paper on organizational transformation methodologies that would be published under Sterling Consulting Group's name. I had scheduled several hours in the business library to review recent academic publications on change management theory, seeking to incorporate the latest research into the frameworks I was developing for our clients. The library had always served as a sanctuary where I could pursue intellectual work without the complications and compromises that characterized my professional life at Sterling Consulting Group. In this environment, I was simply a researcher and strategist engaged in meaningful work, free from the need to navigate the complex dynamics of credit and recognition that had become so problematic in my daily professional interactions. Dr. Chen approached me during a break in my research, having recognized me from my graduate school years when she had served as a guest lecturer in several of my organizational psychology courses. She remembered my master's thesis on organizational restructuring and expressed genuine interest in learning about my current work and career development since completing my degree 15 years earlier. This simple question created an unexpected opportunity for reflection and honest conversation about the trajectory my professional life had taken. As I began describing my role at Sterling Consulting Group, I found myself automatically falling into the established narrative that portrayed Jonathan as the visionary leader, while characterizing my contributions as research support and analytical assistance. Dr. Chen listened with the focused attention of someone who was trained to recognize patterns and discrepancies in professional narratives. And after several minutes of my explanation, she asked a question that stopped me entirely in my prepared presentation. "Victoria," she said with the gentle directness that characterized effective coaching conversations, "I am having difficulty reconciling the person who wrote that exceptional thesis on organizational transformation with someone who describes herself as providing research support. Based on your graduate work and the publications I have seen with your name attached, you possess expertise that exceeds that of most senior consultants in major firms. What happened to that person? And why are you presenting yourself as someone else?" Her question created a moment of cognitive dissonance that forced me to examine the disconnect between my actual capabilities and the professional identity I had been presenting both to others and to myself. For 15 years, I had been so focused on accommodating Jonathan's need for recognition and maintaining harmony in our business partnership that I had gradually internalized a diminished version of my own professional value and potential. The woman who had graduated summa cum laude with groundbreaking research had somehow convinced herself that she was qualified only to provide support services to someone whose expertise was actually inferior to her own. Dr. Chen recognized my discomfort with her question and the internal conflict it had created, but rather than allowing me to retreat into comfortable deflection, she continued to probe the assumptions and beliefs that had led me to accept such a dramatic underutilization of my capabilities. She explained that in her 30 years of executive coaching, she had observed that highly capable individuals often became trapped in situations that diminished their potential, not through lack of ability or opportunity, but through gradual accommodation to systems and relationships that benefited from their diminished self-perception. "The most tragic cases I encounter," Dr. Chen continued, "are not people who lack talent or opportunity, but people who possess exceptional capabilities but have been convinced that those capabilities are ordinary or insufficient. These individuals often become the invisible engines behind someone else's success, providing the intellectual and analytical foundation while allowing others to claim the recognition and advancement opportunities." Her description resonated so powerfully with my own experience that I found myself sharing details about my relationship with Jonathan and the systematic pattern of credit appropriation that had characterized our professional partnership. As I described specific examples of my contributions being presented as his insights, Dr. Chen nodded with the recognition of someone who had seen similar patterns many times before. Her familiarity with these dynamics was both validating and troubling, as it suggested that my situation was not unique, but rather representative of a broader pattern that affected many talented professionals. Dr. Chen helped me understand that the accommodation patterns I had developed were not simply the result of personal weakness or poor judgment, but rather predictable responses to systematic manipulation that had been designed to obscure the true source of our business success. She explained that individuals who possess exceptional analytical capabilities are often targeted by people who recognize their talent but lack similar abilities themselves. These relationships typically begin as genuine partnerships but gradually evolve into exploitative arrangements where the talented individual provides the intellectual foundation, while the other person claims the recognition and advancement opportunities. The manipulation is typically so gradual and subtle that the talented individual does not recognize what is happening until the pattern has become deeply entrenched and difficult to challenge. The exploitative partner uses techniques such as consistently interrupting or dismissing contributions, attributing successes to their own leadership while attributing failures to inadequate support, and gradually isolating the talented individual from direct relationships with clients or industry peers who might recognize their true capabilities. What makes these situations particularly insidious, Dr. Chen explained, is that the talented individual often becomes complicit in their own marginalization by accepting increasingly diminished roles in exchange for stability and conflict avoidance. They convince themselves that their contributions are being recognized in private even if they are not acknowledged publicly, and they rationalize the arrangement as necessary for the success of the shared enterprise. This explanation provided a framework for understanding how I had gradually transitioned from equal partner to invisible contributor, without recognizing the systematic nature of the process. Each individual accommodation had seemed reasonable and minor, But collectively, they had created a dynamic where Jonathan received all the recognition while I provided all the intellectual foundation. The arrangement had become so normalized that I had stopped questioning its fairness or sustainability, instead internalizing doubts about my own worth and capabilities. Dr. Chen then shifted the conversation towards solutions and possibilities, rather than continuing to analyze the problems with my current situation. She explained that individuals who found themselves in these exploitative arrangements often possessed far more power and independence than they realized, but that recognizing and exercising this power required a fundamental shift in self-perception and professional identity. The first step, she said, is to conduct an honest assessment of your actual contributions and capabilities, independent of how those contributions have been recognized or valued by others. This assessment must be based on objective evidence, rather than the internalized messages you have received about your worth and potential. She guided me through an exercise where I documented my role in Sterling Consulting Group's major successes, focusing specifically on the intellectual and analytical work that had created value for our clients. This documentation process revealed patterns that I had not previously recognized, including the fact that virtually every innovative methodology or analytical framework that had distinguished our firm from competitors had originated from my research and development work. The exercise also revealed that my client relationships were often deeper and more substantive than Jonathan's connections, despite his role as the primary relationship manager. Clients consistently sought my input on complex analytical questions and relied on my expertise to solve problems that were beyond Jonathan's capabilities. Many of our most valuable client relationships had developed specifically because of my analytical contributions, even though Jonathan received credit for business development and relationship management. Dr. Chen helped me understand that this pattern of client dependence on my expertise represented a form of professional capital that existed independently of my relationship with Jonathan. These clients valued my capabilities and insights, and many would likely prefer to work directly with me if given the opportunity. This realization was both empowering and somewhat overwhelming, as it suggested possibilities for professional independence that I had not previously considered. The second step, Dr. Chen continued, is to recognize that your current situation is not permanent or unchangeable, but rather the result of choices that can be modified or reversed. You have been operating under the assumption that challenging the established dynamic would be risky or destructive, but maintaining the status quo is actually the riskier choice, because it prevents you from reaching your potential and building the professional recognition you deserve. She explained that many talented individuals remain trapped in exploitative arrangements because they overestimate the risks associated with change while underestimating the costs of continued accommodation. The fear of losing security or stability prevents them from pursuing opportunities that would provide greater fulfillment and recognition, even when their current situation is fundamentally unsustainable. Dr. Chen introduced me to the concept of authentic professional identity, which she defined as alignment between your actual capabilities and the recognition and opportunities you receive for those capabilities. She explained that individuals who achieve authentic professional identity experience greater job satisfaction, more sustainable success, and better relationships with colleagues and clients, because they are operating from a foundation of honesty and integrity rather than accommodation and compromise. The process of reclaiming authentic professional identity, she explained, typically involves some period of uncertainty and conflict as established patterns are challenged and new dynamics are developed. However, this temporary discomfort is necessary for creating long-term alignment between your contributions and your recognition. Dr. Chen also helped me understand that the Chicago Business Excellence Award represented a unique opportunity to begin asserting my authentic professional identity in a public forum where the evidence of my contributions would be difficult to dispute or minimize. Rather than viewing the award ceremony as a potential source of conflict or controversy, I could approach it as a platform for beginning to claim appropriate recognition for my work. She suggested that I prepare for the ceremony by developing clear, factual statements about my role in the award-winning project that could be shared with industry peers and media representatives who might be present. These statements should focus on specific contributions and methodologies rather than generalized claims about partnership or collaboration, as specificity would make it more difficult for Jonathan or others to minimize or reframe my role. The key, Dr. Chen emphasized, is to approach this transition from a position of strength and confidence, rather than defensiveness or anger. You are not asking for charity or making unreasonable demands for recognition. You are simply claiming appropriate acknowledgement for work that you have actually performed and value that you have genuinely created. Our conversation concluded with Dr. Chen offering to serve as an ongoing advisor and coach as I navigated the process of reclaiming my authentic professional identity. She explained that most successful transitions of this type required sustained effort and support, as established patterns and relationships do not change easily or quickly. Having access to guidance from someone who understood both the psychological and practical aspects of professional transformation could significantly improve my chances of success while reducing the emotional stress associated with major change. As I left Northwestern that afternoon, I felt fundamentally different than I had when I arrived that morning. The conversation with Dr. Chen had provided not only validation for my concerns about recognition and credit, but also a framework for understanding how I had become trapped in an exploitative arrangement and a methodology for creating positive change. Most importantly, she had helped me recognize that my situation was not unique or insurmountable, but rather a common challenge that could be addressed through systematic effort and strategic thinking. The internal conflict and self-doubt that had characterized the previous weeks began to dissipate as I developed confidence in both my analysis of the situation and my plan for addressing it. The Chicago Business Excellence Awards ceremony was now only 3 days away, and rather than viewing it as a source of stress or potential conflict, I began to see it as the beginning of my emergence, as the recognized leader and innovator that I had always been, but had never been allowed to become. Dr. Chen had provided the perspective and wisdom necessary for me to move beyond accommodation and compromise toward authentic self-expression and professional recognition. The transformation was accelerating, and there would be no turning back to the diminished identity that had characterized my professional life for 15 years. The 48 hours following my conversation with Dr. Chen marked the most decisive period of my professional life, as I moved from contemplating change to implementing actions that would make retreat impossible. Armed with her framework for understanding my situation and her practical guidance for reclaiming my authentic professional identity, I began executing a systematic plan that would fundamentally alter the power dynamics between Jonathan and myself, while establishing my rightful position as the intellectual architect of Sterling Consulting Group's success. The first concrete action I took was to contact Sarah Mitchell, the senior business reporter for the Chicago Tribune, who had been assigned to cover the Chicago Business Excellence Awards ceremony. Sarah had written several feature articles about successful consulting firms in the metropolitan area, and her coverage of the awards ceremony would likely reach thousands of industry professionals and potential clients. Rather than allowing Jonathan to serve as the sole source of information about Sterling Consulting Group's award-winning work, I decided to proactively share my perspective on the methodologies and analytical frameworks that had made our success possible. When I called Sarah to request an interview, I was surprised by her immediate interest and enthusiasm. She explained that she had been researching Sterling Consulting Group's background for her article about the award recipients and had encountered several references to innovative methodologies that had distinguished our firm from competitors. However, her attempts to understand the technical details and theoretical foundations of these approaches through conversations with Jonathan had been frustrating, as he seemed unable to provide the depth of explanation that would allow her to accurately describe our competitive advantages. Sarah's comment about Jonathan's inability to explain our methodologies provided additional confirmation of Dr. Chen's analysis regarding the true source of our business success. Jonathan's role as the public face of Sterling Consulting Group had been effective for relationship management and general business development, but it had created problems when industry observers or potential clients sought detailed understanding of the intellectual property that formed the foundation of our services. During our 90-minute interview, I provided Sarah with comprehensive information about the research and development process that had led to our award-winning transformation methodology. I explained the theoretical frameworks that had informed my approach, described the analytical tools and assessment instruments I had developed, and detailed the implementation strategies that had enabled us to achieve exceptional results for our clients. Most importantly, I shared specific examples of how these methodologies had been applied to solve complex organizational challenges that other consulting firms had been unable to address effectively. Sarah's questions revealed her genuine interest in understanding the intellectual substance behind Sterling Consulting Group's reputation, and her follow-up inquiries demonstrated that she possessed the analytical capability to appreciate the sophistication and innovation that characterized my work. By the end of our conversation, she had gathered enough material for a detailed feature article that would, for the first time, provide accurate information about the true source of our firm's competitive advantages and success. The interview with Sarah represented my first public assertion of my role in Sterling Consulting Group's achievements, and it marked a point of no return in my relationship with Jonathan and our established business dynamic. Once the article was published, it would be impossible to maintain the fiction that Jonathan was the singular architect of our success, as the detailed technical information I had provided could only have come from someone with extensive expertise in organizational transformation theory and methodology. The second decisive action I took was to schedule individual meetings with 3 of our most important clients, ostensibly to discuss their satisfaction with our services and to explore opportunities for expanded engagement. However, my actual purpose was to begin establishing direct relationships with these clients that were based on recognition of my analytical capabilities, rather than my role as Jonathan's supportive partner. These meetings would provide me with independent validation of my value to our client base, while creating professional relationships that could support my career development regardless of what happened to my partnership with Jonathan. The first meeting was with David Richardson, the Chief Operating Officer of Midwest Manufacturing Alliance, whose organizational transformation had been the centerpiece of our award-winning submission. David had worked closely with me throughout the 18-month engagement, and I knew that he understood the extent of my contributions to his company's remarkable improvements in operational efficiency and workforce development. When I met with David at his corporate headquarters, he immediately expressed appreciation for the opportunity to discuss our work together, without the usual protocol that required all communications to flow through Jonathan as the primary relationship manager. David's comments revealed that he had often felt frustrated by the need to communicate complex technical questions through Jonathan, who typically required several days to provide responses that David suspected were developed by someone else with greater analytical expertise. "Victoria," David said with characteristic directness, "I have always known that you are the person actually developing the methodologies and solutions that transformed our operations. Jonathan is an effective communicator and relationship manager, but the sophisticated analytical work came from you. I have recommended Sterling Consulting Group to other organizations specifically because of your capabilities, not because of Jonathan's leadership." David's validation of my central role in his company's transformation provided powerful confirmation that my assessment of our respective contributions was accurate rather than biased by frustration or resentment. More importantly, his comments suggested that other clients had similar awareness of the true source of our analytical capabilities, and that my concerns about damaging client relationships by asserting my rightful role were unfounded. During our conversation, David also revealed that his company's board of directors had been so impressed with the results of our engagement that they were considering a significant expansion of their relationship with Sterling Consulting Group. However, the expanded engagement would require extensive analytical work and methodology development that would be beyond Jonathan's capabilities without substantial support from someone with advanced expertise in organizational transformation theory. David's implicit message was clear. Midwest Manufacturing Alliance valued their relationship with Sterling Consulting Group specifically because of my analytical capabilities, and any future engagement would depend on my continued involvement in developing and implementing solutions for their organizational challenges. This conversation provided concrete evidence that my client relationships were based on appreciation for my expertise rather than loyalty to Jonathan's leadership, which meant that I possessed independent professional value that could support career development outside of our current partnership arrangement. The meetings with our other major clients produced similar results, with each conversation confirming that my analytical contributions were recognized and valued by the people who had benefited most directly from our work. These clients had developed what were essentially personal relationships with me, based on respect for my problem-solving capabilities and appreciation for my ability to translate complex theoretical concepts into practical implementation strategies. The third decisive action I took was to register for the National Organizational Development Conference, which would be held in San Francisco 6 weeks after the Chicago Business Excellence Award ceremony. This conference represented the premier gathering of consulting professionals who specialized in organizational transformation and change management, and attendance would provide me with opportunities to establish relationships with industry leaders who were unaware of my previous marginalization within Sterling Consulting Group. More significantly, I submitted a presentation proposal for the conference that focused on the innovative methodologies I had developed for accelerating organizational transformation while maintaining employee engagement and operational stability. The presentation would be delivered under my name alone, without any reference to Sterling Consulting Group or my partnership with Jonathan. This would mark my emergence as an independent thought leader and expert practitioner whose professional identity was not dependent on institutional affiliation or collaborative relationships. The presentation proposal was accepted within 2 weeks, and I received notification that my session had been selected as one of the featured presentations for the conference's opening day. This recognition validated my expertise while providing a platform for establishing my professional reputation independent of any association with Jonathan or Sterling Consulting Group. The acceptance of my presentation proposal represented another point of no return in my transformation process. Once I delivered this presentation to hundreds of industry professionals, I would be publicly established as an expert and thought leader whose capabilities were recognized by the premier professional organization in our field. This recognition would make it impossible for Jonathan or anyone else to minimize my role in developing the methodologies and frameworks that had distinguished our work from that of our competitors. As these commitments and actions accumulated, I began to experience a profound shift in my understanding of my own professional identity and potential. The woman who had accommodated Jonathan's need for singular recognition for 15 years was being replaced by someone who understood her own value and was willing to assert her rightful place in the business success she had created. This transformation was both exhilarating and terrifying, as it required me to abandon familiar patterns of accommodation and self-denial in favor of authentic self-expression and professional advocacy. The most challenging aspect of this transition was managing my relationship with Jonathan during the period when I was taking actions that would fundamentally alter our business dynamic, without discussing these actions with him directly. I continued to fulfill my responsibilities for ongoing client projects and administrative tasks, but I was simultaneously building the foundation for professional independence that would make me less dependent on his cooperation and support. This approach created internal tension between my desire for honesty and transparency in our personal relationship, and my recognition that premature disclosure of my transformation plan might provoke defensive reactions that could undermine my efforts to establish independent professional credibility. Dr. Chen had advised me that successful transitions of this type typically required a period of private preparation before public assertion, as individuals who felt threatened by proposed changes often became obstacles to the very changes that would ultimately benefit everyone involved. The Chicago Business Excellence Awards ceremony was now only 24 hours away, and I understood that it would serve as the public launching point for my emergence as the recognized expert and thought leader that I had always been but had never been allowed to become. The preparations I had made over the previous weeks had created momentum that would carry me through whatever challenges or resistance might emerge from Jonathan or others who were invested in maintaining the established narrative about our business success. The evening before the ceremony, I spent several hours reviewing the materials I had prepared for potential conversations with industry peers, clients, and media representatives who would be present at the event. These materials included detailed descriptions of the methodologies I had developed, case studies that demonstrated the effectiveness of my analytical approaches, and contact information for clients who could provide independent validation of my contributions to their organizational transformations. I also prepared responses to questions that Jonathan might ask about my increased visibility and public assertions of my role in our business success. These responses were designed to be factual and non-confrontational, while making it clear that I was no longer willing to accept marginalization or credit appropriation as acceptable elements of our working relationship. As I concluded my preparations and reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment, I felt a combination of confidence and anticipation that was qualitatively different from any emotion I had experienced during my years of professional accommodation. The woman who would attend the Chicago Business Excellence Awards ceremony would be fundamentally different from the person who had accompanied Jonathan to similar events in the past. Rather than serving as a silent and supportive accessory to his success, I would be present as a professional equal who was prepared to claim appropriate recognition for work that I had actually performed and value that I had genuinely created. The transformation was complete, and there would be no returning to the diminished identity that had characterized my professional life for 15 years. The point of no return had been reached and passed, and the next phase of my journey was about to begin. Tomorrow evening would mark not only the recognition of Sterling Consulting Group's excellence, but also the emergence of Victoria Sterling as an independent force in the organizational development field, with or without Jonathan's cooperation or support. The morning of the Chicago Business Excellence Award ceremony brought the first tangible validation of my strategic decision to assert my authentic professional identity. Sarah Mitchell's feature article in the Chicago Tribune had been published in the business section with the headline "The Analytical Mind Behind Sterling Consulting Group's Award-Winning Success." The article provided detailed coverage of the methodologies I had developed for organizational transformation, complete with specific examples of how these approaches had generated exceptional results for our clients. Most significantly, the article positioned me as the intellectual architect of Sterling Consulting Group's competitive advantages, while describing Jonathan's role in terms of business development and relationship management. Sarah had skillfully woven together the technical information I had provided with quotes from David Richardson and other clients, who confirmed my central role in developing the solutions that had transformed their organizations. The result was a comprehensive and authoritative account that established my expertise while maintaining professional respect for Jonathan's contributions to our business success. The immediate response to the article exceeded my most optimistic expectations. By 9 o'clock that morning, I had received 12 phone calls and 17 email messages from industry professionals, potential clients, and business journalists who wanted to learn more about my work and explore opportunities for collaboration or consultation. Several of these inquiries came from senior executives at Fortune 500 companies who had been following Sterling Consulting Group's success but had not previously understood the specific methodologies that had enabled our exceptional results. The most significant response came from Dr. Robert Martinez, the Director of Organizational Development at the Chicago Economic Development Council, who called to discuss the possibility of my serving as the lead consultant for a major initiative designed to help mid-size manufacturing companies improve their operational efficiency and competitive positioning. Dr. Martinez explained that his organization had been seeking an expert who possessed the specific combination of theoretical knowledge and practical implementation experience that my work demonstrated, and the Tribune article had convinced him that I was uniquely qualified for this challenging engagement. The conversation with Dr. Martinez revealed the extent to which my previous marginalization had prevented the business community from recognizing capabilities that were directly relevant to their most pressing organizational challenges. He described several initiatives that had failed to achieve their objectives because the consulting firms involved had lacked the analytical sophistication necessary to address complex transformation requirements. My methodologies appeared to offer solutions to problems that other consultants had been unable to solve effectively. Dr. Martinez's interest in my services was particularly significant because the Chicago Economic Development Council represented one of the most prestigious consulting opportunities available in the metropolitan area. The organization worked exclusively with highly qualified experts who possessed demonstrated expertise in their respective fields, and an engagement with the council would establish my professional credibility at the highest levels of the Chicago business community. During our conversation, Dr. Martinez also mentioned that he had been impressed by the specific results that Midwest Manufacturing Alliance had achieved through their engagement with Sterling Consulting Group. He had attempted to discuss these methodologies with Jonathan at a previous industry event, but had found their conversation unsatisfying, because Jonathan had been unable to provide the technical depth that would have enabled Dr. Martinez to understand how these approaches might be adapted for other organizational contexts. This comment provided additional confirmation that my assessment of our respective capabilities had been accurate rather than distorted by personal frustration or bias. Industry professionals who attempted to engage with Jonathan about the intellectual substance of our work consistently encountered limitations that became apparent when detailed technical discussions were required. My emergence as the recognized source of our analytical capabilities would address a communication gap that had previously prevented potential clients from fully understanding the value we could provide. The second major validation occurred when I received a call from Jennifer Walsh, the conference director for the National Organizational Development Conference, who had been contacted by several attendees inquiring about my background and expertise in advance of my scheduled presentation. Jennifer explained that the level of pre-conference interest in my session was unusually high, and she requested permission to feature my presentation in the conference marketing materials that would be distributed to industry publications and professional associations. Jennifer's request represented recognition that my expertise had generated significant interest within the organizational development community, even though my professional visibility had been limited by years of systematic marginalization. The methodologies I had developed were apparently addressing theoretical and practical challenges that other experts in the field were struggling to solve, which created natural curiosity about my approaches and potential applications. The conference marketing exposure would reach thousands of consulting professionals and potential clients who were unaware of my previous work, providing opportunities to establish relationships that were based on recognition of my capabilities, rather than my historical role as Jonathan's supportive partner. This expanded professional network would create momentum for continued career development that would be independent of any institutional affiliations or collaborative arrangements. The third validation came through responses from existing clients who had read the Tribune article and wanted to express their appreciation for having their experiences accurately represented in the media coverage. David Richardson called to congratulate me on the recognition and to confirm that his description of my contributions had been quoted accurately and appropriately. He also mentioned that several members of his board of directors had been impressed by the article and were eager to discuss the expanded engagement that had been under consideration for several months. Similar responses came from leaders at our other major client organizations, each expressing satisfaction that the true source of our analytical capabilities had finally been acknowledged publicly. These conversations revealed that our clients had been aware of the disconnect between Jonathan's public role and my actual contributions for years, but had accommodated the arrangement because they valued the results we delivered regardless of internal credit allocation. However, the publication of the Tribune article had created an opportunity for these clients to acknowledge their awareness of my central role, without seeming to undermine Jonathan's position or create awkwardness in their business relationships. Several clients mentioned that they had been hoping for an opportunity to work more directly with me on future projects, as they recognized that my analytical capabilities were the primary source of value in our consulting engagements. These client responses demonstrated that my concerns about damaging business relationships by asserting my rightful role had been unfounded. Rather than creating confusion or instability, the accurate representation of our respective contributions had been welcomed by clients who appreciated having clarity about the source of the expertise they were purchasing. The revelation had strengthened rather than weakened these important business relationships. As I prepared for the award ceremony that evening, I also received an unexpected call from Dr. Chen, who had seen the Tribune article and wanted to congratulate me on the progress I had made in reclaiming my authentic professional identity. She explained that the speed and effectiveness of my transformation had been exceptional, as most professionals who found themselves in similar situations required months or years to develop the confidence and strategic thinking necessary for successful change. Dr. Chen's analysis of my progress helped me understand that the actions I had taken over the previous weeks represented more than simple career advancement or recognition seeking. I had systematically dismantled a complex web of accommodation and self-denial that had prevented me from expressing my full capabilities, while simultaneously building the foundation for sustainable professional success that aligned with my actual expertise and potential. The momentum that had been created through these initial victories was qualitatively different from the incremental progress that characterized most career development efforts. Rather than gradually improving my position within existing constraints, I had fundamentally altered the context within which my professional value was recognized and appreciated. The woman who would attend the award ceremony that evening possessed a level of industry recognition and client validation that had been unimaginable just weeks earlier. However, the most significant aspect of these early victories was not the external recognition they represented, but the internal transformation they had enabled. For 15 years, I had operated under the assumption that my professional worth was dependent on Jonathan's willingness to acknowledge my contributions and provide opportunities for advancement. The success of my independent efforts had demonstrated that my capabilities possessed inherent value that could be recognized and rewarded regardless of his cooperation or support. This recognition had liberated me from the psychological constraints that had limited my thinking about career possibilities and professional potential. Rather than trying to maximize my success within the narrow parameters that had been established by our existing partnership, I was now free to pursue opportunities that fully utilized my analytical capabilities and theoretical expertise. The fear of losing security or stability that had previously prevented me from challenging established patterns had been replaced by confidence in my ability to create professional success through direct application of my skills and knowledge. The transformation in my self-perception had also affected how I approached interactions with Jonathan during the final preparations for the award ceremony. Rather than feeling anxious about his potential reactions to my increased visibility, I approached our conversations with the calm confidence of someone who understood her own value and was prepared to claim appropriate recognition for work she had actually performed. When Jonathan mentioned that he had received several calls from colleagues who had seen the Tribune article, I responded with factual information about the interview process and the content that had been included in the published piece. When he expressed surprise at the level of technical detail that had been provided, I explained that Sarah Mitchell had requested comprehensive information about our methodologies in order to write an accurate and informative article about our award-winning work. Jonathan's responses to these conversations revealed his awareness that something fundamental had changed in our professional dynamic, although he appeared uncertain about the implications or appropriate responses. His usual patterns of minimizing my contributions or redirecting attention to his own role seemed inadequate for addressing a situation where my expertise had been publicly validated by independent sources. The confidence and authority with which I discussed my work made it difficult for him to dismiss or diminish my contributions without appearing obviously unreasonable. As the day progressed, I realized that Jonathan was struggling to reconcile the established narrative of his singular leadership with the emerging recognition of my central role in our business success. The cognitive dissonance was creating uncertainty about how to present himself at the award ceremony, as his usual approach of accepting sole credit for our achievements would now contradict publicly available information about the true source of our competitive advantages. This uncertainty represented a significant shift in the power dynamics that had characterized our relationship for 15 years. Rather than feeling dependent on his approval or cooperation, I was now in a position where his professional credibility was partially dependent on his willingness to acknowledge my contributions accurately and appropriately. The transformation had created a more balanced and honest foundation for our working relationship, regardless of how that relationship might evolve in the future. The afternoon before the ceremony, I received a final validation that confirmed the strategic wisdom of my decision to assert my authentic professional identity. Margaret Thompson, the executive director of the Chicago Business Excellence Awards, called to request a brief meeting before the evening's festivities began. Margaret explained that the selection committee had been impressed by the Tribune article and wanted to ensure that the award presentation accurately reflected the collaborative nature of Sterling Consulting Group's success. Margaret's request represented official recognition that my role in our award-winning work deserved acknowledgement during the ceremony itself. Rather than allowing Jonathan to accept the award as the singular representative of our firm's achievements, the ceremony would include specific mention of my contributions to the methodologies and analytical frameworks that had distinguished our work from that of other consulting organizations. This recognition by the awards committee provided the perfect culmination for the momentum that had been building throughout the day. The evening ceremony would mark not only the recognition of Sterling Consulting Group's excellence, but also my emergence as a publicly acknowledged expert whose capabilities were valued by clients, respected by peers, and recognized by the premier business organizations in our metropolitan area. As I prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most significant evening of my professional life, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment of recognition and validation. The woman who had accommodated Jonathan's success for 15 years had been transformed into someone who understood her own value and was prepared to claim the recognition she had earned through exceptional analytical work and innovative problem-solving. The first victories had been achieved, and the momentum was accelerating toward even greater opportunities for professional growth and meaningful contribution. The award ceremony would mark the beginning of a new phase in my career, one characterized by authentic self-expression and recognition that aligned with my actual capabilities and contributions. The success of my public emergence as the intellectual architect behind Sterling Consulting Group's achievements created an unexpected and increasingly hostile response from individuals and organizations who had been invested in maintaining the established narrative of Jonathan's singular leadership. This opposition manifested in subtle but persistent attempts to undermine my credibility, while preserving the professional relationships and business arrangements that had benefited from my previous invisibility. The first indication of organized resistance emerged 3 days after the Chicago Tribune article was published, when I received a call from Richard Blackstone, the managing partner of Blackstone Associates, one of Chicago's most established consulting firms, and Sterling Consulting Group's primary competitor for high-value organizational transformation engagements. Richard had known Jonathan for over a decade through various industry associations, and had consistently positioned his firm as the more experienced and credible alternative to what he characterized as Sterling's newer and less proven methodologies. Richard's call was ostensibly a congratulatory message regarding the recent media coverage and award recognition, but his underlying purpose became apparent as the conversation progressed. He began by acknowledging the innovative nature of the methodologies described in the Tribune article, while expressing surprise that such sophisticated analytical frameworks had emerged from what he had previously understood to be a relatively small consulting operation, with limited theoretical foundations. His comments were carefully crafted to appear complimentary while subtly questioning the authenticity of my contributions and the accuracy of the media coverage. Richard suggested that the complexity of the methodologies described in the article seemed inconsistent with the public profile that Sterling Consulting Group had maintained over the previous 15 years, implying that either the media coverage was exaggerated or that significant capabilities had been systematically concealed from industry peers and potential clients. The most insidious aspect of Richard's approach was his suggestion that the recent emphasis on my role in developing Sterling's analytical frameworks might represent an attempt to revise history for marketing purposes rather than an accurate representation of our firm's actual development process. He mentioned that several colleagues in the industry had expressed confusion about the apparent inconsistency between Jonathan's previous presentations at industry conferences and the sophisticated theoretical work that was now being attributed to Sterling Consulting Group's success. Richard's implication was clear. My emergence as a recognized expert was being characterized as opportunistic positioning rather than legitimate recognition of capabilities that had been systematically overlooked. This narrative was particularly damaging because it suggested that my recent visibility represented dishonest marketing rather than honest acknowledgement of contributions that had been made but not previously recognized. The conversation concluded with Richard offering to discuss potential collaboration opportunities between our firms, ostensibly to leverage what he described as our complementary capabilities and market positioning. However, his specific suggestions revealed his actual purpose, which was to establish a business relationship that would position Blackstone Associates as the senior partner, while reducing Sterling Consulting Group to a subordinate role that provided specialized analytical support for projects that would be managed and presented by his more established organization. This proposed arrangement would have effectively recreated the marginalization I had experienced with Jonathan, but at an organizational level where my contributions would be subsumed within a larger firm's operations and credited to their leadership team. Richard's offer represented an attempt to neutralize the competitive threat that my emergence posed to established firms by incorporating my capabilities within existing power structures that would maintain traditional hierarchies and credit allocation patterns. The second form of opposition emerged through Jonathan's social and professional network, where several individuals began expressing concerns about the potential impact of my increased visibility on Sterling Consulting Group's established client relationships and industry reputation. These concerns were typically presented as well-meaning advice about the risks of making dramatic changes to successful business arrangements, but their cumulative effect was to create pressure for returning to the collaborative dynamic that had previously characterized our partnership. The most persistent advocate for this position was Thomas Webb, a longtime client who had worked with Sterling Consulting Group on multiple engagements over the past 8 years. Thomas had developed a comfortable working relationship with Jonathan that was based on clear role definitions and predictable communication patterns, and he expressed anxiety about how the recent changes in our public positioning might affect the stability and effectiveness of our consulting services. Thomas's concerns were representative of a broader pattern among clients who had become accustomed to working with Jonathan as the primary relationship manager while receiving analytical services that they understood to be provided by qualified support staff. The revelation that their analytical support had actually been provided by an expert whose capabilities exceeded those of many senior consultants in major firms created cognitive dissonance that some clients found uncomfortable and potentially destabilizing. Several clients expressed worry that my increased professional profile might lead to higher consulting fees or reduced availability for their projects, as they assumed that recognition would naturally result in demands for compensation and treatment that reflected my actual contributions to their organizational transformations. These concerns were based on the assumption that fair recognition of my role would necessarily disrupt the business arrangements that had provided them with exceptional analytical services at rates that had been artificially low due to my systematic undervaluation. The most problematic aspect of this client resistance was its foundation in economic self-interest, rather than legitimate concerns about service quality or relationship stability. These clients had benefited significantly from having access to sophisticated analytical capabilities at consulting rates that reflected Jonathan's lesser expertise, rather than the true value of the methodologies I had developed. They were naturally reluctant to support changes that might result in more accurate pricing that reflected the actual value they had been receiving. Thomas and several other clients began expressing these concerns to Jonathan directly, creating pressure for him to reassert control over our firm's public positioning and to minimize my role in future marketing and relationship management activities. They suggested that Sterling Consulting Group's success had been built on Jonathan's leadership and relationship management capabilities, and that excessive emphasis on technical methodologies might alienate clients who valued personal relationships over analytical sophistication. This client pressure created a particularly challenging dynamic because it provided Jonathan with external justification for resisting the changes I was implementing, while appearing to be motivated by business considerations, rather than personal ego or credit appropriation. He could present client concerns as evidence that my increased visibility was damaging to our shared business interests, rather than acknowledging that these concerns were primarily based on economic self-interest and resistance to paying fair compensation for exceptional analytical services. The third form of opposition emerged from industry associations and professional organizations that had previously featured Jonathan as a speaker and thought leader based on his public role as Sterling Consulting Group's founder and primary representative. Several of these organizations expressed confusion about the apparent inconsistency between Jonathan's previous presentations and the sophisticated theoretical work that was now being attributed to our firm's success. The Chicago Management Consultants Association, where Jonathan had served on the board of directors for 3 years, requested a meeting to discuss what they characterized as concerns about professional representation and accurate attribution of intellectual property within the consulting industry. The association's president, Michael Davidson, explained that several members had raised questions about the ethical implications of presenting work as one's own innovation when significant contributions had been made by others who were not acknowledged or recognized. Michael's concerns were ostensibly about maintaining professional standards and ensuring accurate representation of capabilities and contributions within the consulting community. However, his specific questions and suggestions revealed that the association was primarily concerned about the precedent that my situation might establish for other consulting partnerships where collaborative work had been presented as individual achievement. The association's board included several senior partners from established firms who had built their reputations through similar arrangements, where they served as the public representatives of analytical work that had been performed by subordinate staff members or collaborative partners. These individuals were naturally concerned that accurate recognition of my contributions might encourage similar assertions from other talented professionals who had been systematically marginalized within their organizations. Michael suggested that the association might need to develop new guidelines for professional representation and attribution of intellectual property, ostensibly to prevent confusion and maintain ethical standards within the industry. However, his proposed guidelines would have effectively institutionalized the credit appropriation patterns that had characterized my relationship with Jonathan, by establishing that senior partners and firm leaders could legitimately claim recognition for work performed by others within their organizations. The most insidious aspect of this institutional opposition was its presentation as a matter of professional ethics and industry standards rather than protection of established power arrangements. The association's concerns were framed in terms of maintaining clarity and preventing misrepresentation, but their actual purpose was to preserve systems that enabled senior professionals to appropriate credit for work performed by talented individuals who lacked the political power or institutional support necessary to claim appropriate recognition. Despite the multifaceted nature of this opposition, I found that my confidence in my position and my commitment to authentic professional representation remained unshaken. The resistance I was encountering actually validated the significance of the changes I was creating, as individuals and organizations only invest energy in opposing developments that pose genuine threats to their established interests and advantages. Dr. Chen had prepared me for this type of resistance by explaining that successful transformations typically provoke defensive reactions from people who have benefited from the arrangements being challenged. She had emphasized that opposition often intensifies before it diminishes, as threatened parties make increasingly desperate attempts to preserve systems that have served their interests at the expense of others. The key to navigating this opposition successfully was maintaining focus on factual accuracy and professional integrity, rather than becoming defensive, or allowing the resistance to undermine my confidence in the legitimacy of my assertions. The evidence supporting my central role in Sterling Consulting Group's success was comprehensive and indisputable, and my recent recognition had been based on independent validation from clients, industry experts, and media professionals who had no motivation to misrepresent the true source of our competitive advantages. Most importantly, the opposition I was facing confirmed that my emergence as a recognized expert posed a genuine threat to arrangements and assumptions that had prevented talented professionals from receiving fair recognition for their contributions. The resistance was not simply about my individual situation, but about broader patterns of credit appropriation and systematic marginalization that characterized many professional relationships within the consulting industry. This recognition transformed my perspective on the opposition from a personal challenge to be managed into a systemic problem that needed to be addressed for the benefit of other talented professionals who might find themselves in similar situations. My success in claiming appropriate recognition for my contributions could serve as a model and inspiration for others who had been trapped in exploitative arrangements that prevented them from reaching their full professional potential. The growing opposition also revealed the extent to which established power structures within the consulting industry were dependent on the invisible contributions of talented individuals who provided intellectual foundation while allowing others to claim recognition and advancement opportunities. The resistance to my emergence suggested that accurate attribution of intellectual property and fair recognition of contributions might threaten the competitive advantages that established firms had built through systematic appropriation of others' capabilities. As I prepared for the award ceremony that would mark the public culmination of my transformation, I understood that the opposition I was facing represented not simply resistance to my individual success, but defense of systems that had enabled the systematic undervaluation of talented professionals throughout the industry. The changes I was creating had implications that extended far beyond my personal situation to encompass fundamental questions about fairness, recognition, and authentic professional representation within collaborative work environments. The opposition was intensifying, but rather than discouraging my commitment to transformation, it was strengthening my resolve to continue pursuing authentic recognition, regardless of the resistance I encountered. The woman who had accommodated unfair treatment for 15 years had been replaced by someone who understood that her individual success could contribute to positive changes that would benefit countless other professionals who deserved recognition for their genuine contributions to organizational success. The evening of the Chicago Business Excellence Awards ceremony arrived with an unexpected complexity that transcended the professional recognition I had worked to achieve. As I prepared for what should have been a moment of triumph and validation, I found myself confronting deeper psychological and emotional challenges that had remained hidden beneath the surface of my systematic efforts to reclaim my authentic professional identity. These challenges emerged not from external opposition or resistance, but from within my own psyche, where years of accommodation and self-denial had created patterns of thinking and feeling that could not be easily resolved through external recognition or professional success. The first indication of these deeper issues arose as I stood before my bedroom mirror, preparing to dress for the ceremony. I had purchased a sophisticated charcoal gray dress that projected professional competence and personal confidence, Yet as I looked at my reflection, I experienced an unexpected wave of anxiety that had nothing to do with the evening's events or the recognition I was about to receive. Instead, I found myself questioning whether I truly deserved the acknowledgement that was coming, whether my contributions had been as significant as I believed, and whether I possessed the capabilities necessary to sustain the professional success I was claiming. These doubts emerged despite the comprehensive evidence I had assembled regarding my role in Sterling Consulting Group's achievements and the independent validation I had received from clients, industry experts, and media professionals. The intellectual case for my rightful recognition was indisputable, yet I discovered that 15 years of systematic marginalization had created internalized beliefs about my worth and capabilities that could not be easily overcome through logical analysis or external confirmation. Dr. Chen had warned me that this type of internal resistance was common among individuals who had experienced prolonged undervaluation, explaining that psychological patterns developed over years of accommodation often persist even after external circumstances have changed dramatically. She had described this phenomenon as imposter syndrome intensification, where increased recognition and opportunity paradoxically trigger greater anxiety about adequacy and authenticity rather than producing the confidence and satisfaction that might be expected. The deeper challenge was not simply about overcoming self-doubt, but about reconstructing my fundamental understanding of my own identity and worth after years of defining myself in relation to Jonathan's success and recognition. I had become so accustomed to measuring my value through his achievements and evaluating my contributions through his acknowledgement that the prospect of independent professional identity felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. As I continued preparing for the ceremony, I realized that my transformation had exposed psychological wounds that had been carefully concealed beneath layers of professional competence and personal accommodation. The systematic erasure of my contributions had not simply affected my career trajectory, but had fundamentally altered my relationship with my own capabilities and potential. I had internalized messages about my limitations and subordinate status so completely that challenging these beliefs required confronting aspects of my self-perception that had remained unexamined for decades. The second dimension of the deeper challenge emerged as I considered the broader implications of my transformation for my marriage and family relationships. Jonathan and I had built our life together around a carefully constructed division of roles and responsibilities that extended far beyond our professional partnership to encompass every aspect of our shared existence. His identity as the successful business leader had been balanced by my role as the supportive partner who managed domestic responsibilities while providing behind-the-scenes assistance for his professional activities. This arrangement had created a complex web of interdependence that could not be easily modified without affecting fundamental aspects of our relationship and family dynamics. My emergence as a recognized expert and independent professional would necessarily alter the power balance between us in ways that might threaten the stability and harmony we had maintained throughout our 15-year marriage. The prospect of these changes was particularly challenging because they occurred within the context of genuine affection and mutual respect that had characterized the positive aspects of our relationship. Jonathan was not a malicious individual who had deliberately exploited my capabilities, but rather someone who had gradually developed patterns of behavior that served his interests, without full awareness of their impact on my professional development and personal fulfillment. This recognition made it difficult to maintain the clarity and determination that had driven my recent transformation efforts. When I observed Jonathan struggling to understand and adapt to the changes I was creating, I experienced conflicting emotions that complicated my commitment to continued growth and recognition. Part of me wanted to protect him from the discomfort and uncertainty that my transformation was creating, even though I understood intellectually that such protection would require me to abandon the authentic professional identity I had worked so hard to establish. The third aspect of the deeper challenge involved confronting the cumulative emotional impact of 15 years of systematic undervaluation and credit appropriation. As my professional recognition increased and my authentic capabilities became more visible, I began to experience anger and resentment about the opportunities that had been lost and the recognition that had been denied during the most productive years of my career. This emotional processing was complicated by the fact that I had spent years suppressing these feelings in order to maintain harmony in my marriage and stability in our business partnership. The accommodation and compromise that had characterized my response to credit appropriation had required me to deny my own emotional reactions and to rationalize treatment that was fundamentally unfair and professionally damaging. The recent validation of my contributions had made it impossible to continue suppressing these emotions, yet I discovered that processing 15 years of accumulated frustration and disappointment was more challenging than I had anticipated. The anger I felt about missed opportunities and stolen recognition was accompanied by self-directed frustration about my own complicity in arrangements that had prevented me from reaching my potential earlier in my career. These emotional complexities were further complicated by my awareness that expressing anger or resentment about past treatment might be counterproductive for my current transformation efforts. The professional recognition I was receiving required me to project confidence and competence, rather than revealing the psychological struggles that had accompanied my journey toward authentic self-expression. However, Dr. Chen had emphasized that successful transformation required processing these difficult emotions rather than continuing to suppress them in service of external expectations or relationship maintenance. She explained that individuals who attempted to bypass the emotional work associated with reclaiming their authentic identity often found that their professional success was undermined by unresolved psychological conflicts that manifested as self-sabotage or inconsistent performance. The fourth dimension of the deeper challenge involved developing new patterns of self-advocacy and boundary maintenance that would support my continued professional growth while protecting me from future exploitation or marginalization. The skills and strategies that had enabled me to reclaim recognition for my past contributions were different from those required to ensure fair treatment and appropriate acknowledgement in future professional relationships. This challenge was particularly complex because it required me to fundamentally alter my approach to collaboration and partnership without becoming defensive or confrontational in ways that might damage valuable professional relationships. I needed to develop the ability to advocate for my interests and contributions while maintaining the collaborative spirit and analytical focus that had made my work valuable to clients and colleagues. The transformation from accommodation to advocacy required me to overcome deeply ingrained patterns of conflict avoidance and people-pleasing that had characterized my approach to professional relationships throughout my career. These patterns had served important functions during my years of marginalization, as they had enabled me to maintain working relationships and continue contributing to organizational success despite the systematic undervaluation I was experiencing. However, the same patterns that had provided psychological protection during my period of marginalization now threatened to undermine the professional recognition and authentic identity I had worked to establish. Learning to assert my worth and claim appropriate recognition without apologizing or minimizing my contributions required developing new capabilities that felt foreign and uncomfortable despite their necessity for continued success. The deeper challenge also encompassed my need to develop resilience and emotional regulation strategies that would enable me to sustain high performance while navigating the increased scrutiny and expectations that accompanied professional recognition. The visibility I had gained through my recent transformation efforts had created opportunities for greater impact and influence, but it had also exposed me to forms of criticism and evaluation that I had previously avoided through my behind-the-scenes role. As I prepared to leave for the award ceremony, I understood that the evening would represent more than professional recognition or validation of my contributions to Sterling Consulting Group's success. It would mark my public emergence as someone who had successfully navigated the complex psychological and emotional challenges associated with reclaiming authentic identity after years of systematic marginalization. The deeper challenge had required me to confront aspects of my personality and history that were painful and difficult to examine, but this internal work had been necessary for creating a foundation that could support sustained professional success and personal fulfillment. The woman who would attend the ceremony that evening possessed not only the intellectual capabilities and professional recognition that had been denied for 15 years, but also the emotional strength and psychological clarity necessary to continue growing and contributing at the highest levels of her field. The process of addressing these deeper challenges had been more difficult and time-intensive than the external actions I had taken to establish my professional credibility, but it had also been more transformative and personally meaningful. The recognition I was about to receive would be satisfying not simply because it acknowledged my past contributions, but because it validated my successful navigation of complex internal obstacles that had once seemed insurmountable. As I completed my preparations and prepared to join Jonathan for the drive to the Palmer House Hilton, I felt a sense of integration and authenticity that had been absent from my professional life for many years. The deeper challenge had been met and overcome, and I was ready to claim the recognition I had earned while maintaining the personal integrity and emotional strength that would support continued growth and contribution throughout the next phase of my career. The internal work was complete, and the external celebration could begin with the confidence that it represented genuine transformation rather than superficial change. The evening ahead would mark not only professional recognition, but personal victory over psychological limitations that had once prevented me from expressing my full potential and claiming the success I deserved. The Chicago Business Excellence Awards ceremony unfolded as a carefully orchestrated validation of everything I had worked to achieve during my transformation journey, but it was a single moment of unexpected clarity during the evening's proceedings that crystallized my complete evolution from marginalized contributor to recognized expert. This breakthrough occurred not during the formal award presentation, but during an impromptu conversation with a group of industry leaders who had gathered around our table following Jonathan's acceptance speech. Jonathan had delivered his prepared remarks with characteristic confidence and eloquence, acknowledging the collaborative nature of Sterling Consulting Group's success while maintaining the established narrative that positioned him as the visionary leader responsible for our firm's innovative methodologies. His speech had been professionally appropriate and personally gracious, including specific mention of my analytical contributions while preserving his role as the primary architect of our business achievements. However, the carefully constructed balance of his presentation began to unravel during the informal networking period that followed the official ceremony. Dr. Patricia Williams, the Chief Strategy Officer at Global Manufacturing Solutions and one of the most respected thought leaders in organizational development, approached our table with specific questions about the theoretical foundations underlying our award-winning transformation methodology. Dr. Williams had been following Sterling Consulting Group's work for several months and had been particularly intrigued by the sophisticated analytical frameworks described in the Chicago Tribune article. She was considering engaging our services for a complex organizational restructuring initiative that would affect over 3,000 employees across multiple international locations, but she needed to understand the intellectual rigor and theoretical grounding that supported our practical implementation strategies. Her initial questions were directed toward Jonathan, as protocol and established practice would suggest. She inquired about the research methodologies we employed to assess organizational readiness for transformation, the theoretical models that informed our change management approaches, and the empirical evidence that supported our claims about accelerated implementation timelines while maintaining employee engagement levels. Jonathan's responses revealed immediately that his understanding of these fundamental aspects of our work was superficial and largely limited to presentation materials, rather than comprehensive knowledge of the underlying analytical principles. He provided general descriptions of our client outcomes and broad explanations of our implementation processes, but he was unable to discuss the specific theoretical frameworks or research methodologies that Dr. Williams needed to evaluate in order to justify a major consulting engagement to her board of directors. After several minutes of increasingly detailed questions that Jonathan was unable to answer satisfactorily, Dr. Williams turned toward me with the expectation that I might be able to provide the technical information she required. This transition represented a pivotal moment where I could either defer to Jonathan's established role as our primary spokesperson or assert my expertise by directly addressing questions that fell within my areas of specialized knowledge and capability. The choice I made in that moment reflected not only my professional competence, but also the internal transformation I had completed during the weeks leading up to the ceremony. Rather than deflecting Dr. Williams' questions or suggesting that she coordinate with Jonathan for follow-up discussions, I began providing comprehensive and detailed responses that demonstrated the depth of my expertise while establishing my credibility as the intellectual architect of our firm's competitive advantages. I explained the organizational psychology principles that informed our assessment methodologies, described the change management theories that guided our implementation strategies, and detailed the empirical research that supported our claims about accelerated transformation timelines. Most importantly, I was able to discuss the innovative aspects of our approaches that distinguished them from conventional consulting methodologies, including specific examples of how these innovations had generated exceptional results for clients facing complex organizational challenges. Dr. Williams' response to my explanations was immediate and unmistakable. Her questions became more sophisticated and focused as she recognized that she was speaking with someone who possessed genuine expertise rather than general familiarity with consulting practices. She began exploring theoretical concepts and practical applications that could only be meaningfully discussed between professionals who shared advanced knowledge of organizational development principles and analytical methodologies. The conversation that developed between Dr. Williams and myself excluded Jonathan entirely, not through any deliberate intention to marginalize him, but because the level of technical discussion required expertise that he simply did not possess. Within 15 minutes, it became apparent to everyone present that I was the source of the intellectual property and analytical capabilities that had generated Sterling Consulting Group's success and industry recognition. This revelation occurred in the presence of several other senior executives and industry thought leaders who had joined our conversation as it progressed. These individuals included Michael Chen, the Director of Organizational Excellence at Fortune Industries, Sarah Davidson, the Chief Operating Officer at Midwest Financial Services, and Robert Martinez from the Chicago Economic Development Council, whom I had spoken with earlier regarding potential collaboration opportunities. The group's recognition of my expertise was accompanied by their growing awareness that the established narrative regarding Sterling Consulting Group's leadership and intellectual foundations had been incomplete or inaccurate. Several participants made comments that revealed their surprise at discovering that the sophisticated analytical work they had attributed to our firm's general capabilities was actually the product of my individual research and development efforts. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.